I'm Joshua, and I'm an INTP, and first and foremost, I would like to say thank you for viewing this video and subsequently visiting my channel. The topic of this video will be on human context, and context is an expression and a phrase and term that I've used in other videos in terms of describing type, I think most recently in my INTP video, and the idea of context or human context is necessary for me to elucidate why exactly I have the models I have of personality theory in terms of topology, and why I'm moving away from the cognitive functions more so. This is just another one of those road work videos that will be necessary for future oncoming material. And so, first, I have to say that the problem with topology, in a certain sense, I guess, when it's divorced from Jung's work, is which, as in most ways it's described, it is. I mean, I guess I can't say that necessarily. There's nothing wrong with Jung's work in terms of trying to fit the individual back into a proper framework in terms of saying that no individual honestly exists outside of a context, a historical context, and a biological context. And it's with this that I have to say that I suppose, I really don't want to change this, but to expound upon this further, because with our understanding, our growing understanding in the fields of cognitive science, neuroscience, and human biology, it is becoming more increasingly the case that believing or stating human existence as a mere biological functioning is seemingly more and more of the case. Though I don't think that people are strictly computational machines, because whatever the brain is necessarily, it's not involved with solely computation in the ways in which a computer or our means of programming information and functions into computers. Whatever the brain does, it is not strictly computation. It seems to be something more than solely computation or input-output processes in terms of mediating information from the environment to the individual, how thoughts emerge, and why specific given actions and phenomenon result in the overall phenomenology of the human experience. I dare not say I know what that is and the total story of that, but I do think, given things like anesthesiology and the fact that you can shut off the conscious mind without making the individual go to sleep and without killing a person, tells me that there are just uncertainties about the brain that are still out there, and what consciousness is from a biological standpoint, or if it actually exists, I cannot answer or say I know. My thought currently is that yes, there is no complete free will for a human being, but there seems to be something. It seems, well, I should first say, yes, I think consciousness exists. I don't know to what extent and what capacity it does. And more so about free will, I don't think that there is much of a there's not free will for in terms of free will in the Judeo-Christian standpoint, but there is a will. People do have wills, and it's certainly the case that we're not completely deterministic. Life is mostly deterministic or quasi-deterministic, and the reason I am saying these things is because though the literature at this point is showing human beings are mostly biologically determined, machines. It is just the case that not all the information's in, and not every mystery has been answered, or every detail been ironed out, and we are far from completely understanding the brain, where we or human behavior and human genetics, where we are at right now. What I can confidently tell an individual is that whenever you are looking at the individual as the individual, or the person as the individual, they only have an existence that is represented that way because of several chains of narrative that really have nothing to do with the individual that you're looking at that present moment in time. And what I mean is this: that you are a part of context, historical context, social familial context. I suppose, let me just break down the context in a hierarchical manner. There is a biological context that precedes any of human existence that makes us look the way that we do through evolutionary processes. And it's the case that we have harmonies and similarities with everything from fish to lizards to crustaceans to birds, and dogs, mammals, primates, to varying degrees in terms of our genetic makeup and in terms of our neurophrenology. It's why we can study rats and understand things about pharmacological matters without actually testing these queries on human beings. There is just this overall makeup that you have as an organism, and that makeup as an organism gives you a script that you will act out and you will be interested in to varying degrees dependent on several other factors. The first context that makes up you, or that you're embedded in, is a biological one or a naturalistic one, because your relation to nature and the way that nature has acted on us and you at any given moment in time is really why you are the way that you are. And that genetic, I'd say, history is certainly something, or genealogy is certainly something that's is acting itself out in your everyday experience. And the easiest example of this is puberty. Everybody goes through it. And so it's the case that you are a biological organism, and it is the fact that you are a biological organism that underpins, gives voice, meaning, and animation to just about everything that is you, whether you are aware of that fact or not. It is also to say that a deeper genetic or I suppose a lower tier genetic context, because there is just the fact that you're a human being that makes you who you are, and there is the fact that you went through an in vitro process. The prenatal environment that you were a part of has a lot to say about several, outside of the features of your genetic template that comes down to you by way of your collected human heritage, as well as the immediate heritage of whatever family lineage you happen to be a part of. But further than that, I would sum that all as the biological context, and let's just say that this is the prenatal context. Further than that, there is the prenatal context that makes you up. And whether or not you were washed in a soup of alcohol as a fetus, whether or not your mother was extremely stressed, the dependency of her diet and several factors, and add some more on, have certain things to say about your cognitive ability, your ability to control your impulses, your ability to regulate your emotions and your moods, your tendency for introversion or extroversion. And it's the case that something that's probably to the chagrin, or I guess distaste of most people to know, is that temperamental factors, even though we might think that they change over time, are pretty fixed. There is, under this level, under this regime of research and analyses, a category called ambiversion, but it is the case that what researchers can tell from just twin studies and various longitudinal developmental studies of children is that traits such as introversion and extroversion are fairly determined and are things that are very consistent, and you will see them in the child by age 5. Various factors like one's level of impulse control are things too that seem to be ironed out in the earliest years of a child's development. The maximum cognitive capacity of a child too seems to be something that is cyclically determined throughout the child's life, but seems to have the greatest propensity to malleability prior to the ages of 6, and have the greatest capacity to be retarded around that time. And it's the case that many aspects or features of your temperamental landscape has honestly been determined to a large extent outside of your volition or your control. And if you wished to change any of these things later on, past the ages of 18 at the very least, it becomes difficult and will become increasingly more difficult as you age and your levels of fluid intelligence decreases with time. And it, even with having your best levels of fluid intelligence, certain items and elements are made out of you before you or your parents are even made aware of certain phenomena. And so it's the case that your prenatal environment and your early childhood environment are also contexts that follow you even now. And there are these collected histories that you really can't escape. And I don't mean to say that you as the individual don't exist, nor your will doesn't exist, but there is a great deal of constraint on life, and there is a deeper pool and landscape that makes up you that doesn't have anything to do with you necessarily. And it's just those are just the first 3 tiers of context. I mean, next would be to say that you're also a cultural and historical you're a cultural, social, historic creature. Social outside of the scope of your biology, but social, historical in terms of the scope of your society and the histories of the individuals that have passed through it hitherto. And it's the case that part of the ways you choose to act, part of the preferences that you have as an individual, are made up for you in terms of the social context that you happen to be a part of, or the social political landscape or socioeconomic class that you are a part of in your conception. And there are certain things that can predict for one's levels of success, that such as their socioeconomic background, better than almost any other category you can find. I mean, they have even stronger predictive validity than things like IQ. But basically, if you make somebody highly conscientious with a fairly high IQ from a very well-to-do socioeconomic background, they will make more money than most other people in their lifetime. And that is the equation and soup, or yeah, I would just say equation that you could write across any person's, I guess, meta narrative, and they would be a highly successful person. And it has next to nothing to do with individual merit or who they choose to be or what they act toward. And some individuals are just born rather lucky in certain regards. And I'm not saying that there is no hope for people or anything like that, or that life is completely deterministic. It's quasi-deterministic, meaning it's mostly deterministic. But I think that the reason for the information is so that one can be made aware, such so that they would not be a victim to whatever context they come from. So I don't want myself saying any of these things to make it seem as if I'm saying that there is no choice on the part of people, or that it's not a fruitful exercise to try to take ownership or sovereignty of one's life and the direction of one's life. But your proclivity to do that and your desire to do that may vary to certain degrees that have nothing to do with your will whatsoever. So just the disclaimer there. Now, I can say more so beyond the cultural, social, historic context, you exist in a temperamental one, because your temperamental variances, those things that seem to be decided to a large extent in your prenatal history, are fairly stable. They do not change very much over time. You can learn new habits, you can learn and adopt different modes and ways of being. You're very much plastic and a behavioral animal. But when I'm talking about the context that makes you up, it mostly has to do with the hardware of your brain rather than the software. I mean, the brain is a very general thing, and no, it's not the case that you can't learn things and that you can't grow as an individual. It is very much so the case that you will change over your lifetime. You will come to understand new things over your lifetime. You will grow to be a different individual as the days pass, as your hormonal levels change, and as you age and your hormonal levels change even more so. But the point I'm trying to make is that your perception in terms of the ways in which you like to slice up the world, whether or not you would think it would be a good idea to be conservative or liberal or anything like that, or maybe no political affiliation at all, has more to do with your temperament and is something that's decided long before you ever hold a political opinion or can vote in a poll booth than you might know. And it's the case that most of who you are in terms of your instinctual temperamental variances are predetermined, and they will be the things that have something to say and weigh in on whether or not you like Hegel or not, or you are into philosophy or anything like that. It's not to say that people with varying temperamental features can't learn to value things outside of their temperamental biases and the temperamental landscape that they happen to be a part of. But let's just say your first inclinations and your first wishes, fantasies, dreams, and tastes are a good description of the temperamental framework that you come with, and you will find that that thing stays fairly consistent over time. And so those are the collected histories or the contexts that make up you as the individual, because you as an individual are, well, you're a conglomeration of things, even outside of just a purely biological standpoint. And you honestly, no matter what tier of resolution or analysis you're looking at when it comes to who you are or how who you are, I mean, there's multiple layers of resolution. What you are, multiple layers of resolution. And how you are. If how isn't the most bloody freaking complicated question there ever has been, I don't know what is. But how you function and exist and just what that means, Jesus, man, that's quite the quandary. And it's the case that there's not very much that's simple in the world, and there's not very much that one could know offhandedly or intuitively about the makeup of existence without a sufficient amount of study and research. And so, I suppose further, the other way in which I use context is when I am trying to talk about what it means to live a meaningful life. And I think it's necessary to understand all of these things in order for one to live a meaningful life, because what dragons you have a lot to do with however these histories sort themselves out in your life. I mean, if you're whatever narrative you find that's just going to give you the spark to really move forward in life has a lot to do with things that you didn't decide or in things that you didn't determine whatsoever. And even, if you want to write like a magnus opus, per se, or make, so Jung has this expression, if you have nothing to create, then if you have no art to create or nothing to create, then make a masterpiece out of yourself. But what you think is a masterpiece for you is going to be different from another person, because your collected histories are different, and your temperamental effects are different from one another. And so, take that for what it's worth. But it is the case that when I talk about context with respects to meaning, I mean only social. And it's something that you have to understand about. I suppose I should find a different word, but I don't know. So maybe we'll just say histories in context. So I'm coming up with this now, or deciding this now. You have histories that make up the context you exist in. Part of the reason I don't really know how to separate these things from one another is because I see you as an embodied thing, embodied in the world, and the world around you is an information-rich matrix, and all the information that's in that landscape is determined by several things that have almost next to nothing to do with one another, but all overlap one another and make up your perception of existence, or your phenomenology. I guess that's the best way to describe it, your phenomenology. Because your phenomenology is determined by several things, some of them a part of you and within you, and some of them extant out there in the world, not a part of you whatsoever. And you're not even aware that they're features of your reality until you take a class on quantum mechanics or electromagnetism. And it's the case that understanding you don't have to understand all of that to understand you, but you do have to understand that and you don't have to understand the details to all of that to understand you, but you do have to understand the fact that you are not this singular little entity, and it's the case that your will and who you are in the world may not be as grand and as large as it might feel to you, and you also are not all that you might think that you are. in everything in your life that you've earned for yourself or you have earned for yourself is not necessarily the result of your hard work alone. And whatever failures you have also in life are not necessarily the result of your choices and your actions whatsoever. I mean, I think if any person is born born into an impoverished background, if they have a bit of I guess observational capacity, they can tell that their parents did not make the best decisions fiscally and I guess educationally or economically, or else they wouldn't be in the sort of situations that they are in. But if you come from a very impoverished background, you have to overcome that thing to a certain extent in a Western sphere in order for yourself to have a meaningful existence. Because something that's pretty damn chilling and tragic about a being in a lower income place, I guess, position in life is that you, on average, will live 20 years less than somebody from. Hold on. On average, will live 20 years less than somebody from a higher economic background, climate, or status. And that's merely because of stress. I mean, poor people undergo a great deal of stress just being in that situation. And so there's a great deal of potential tragedy and disparity which you have to contend with. And I think it not to say like the point of life is to live a very long time, but it's the case that if I think that I look at it like this: if you want to have a life where you can feel as if you have more agency and autonomy in your realm, you certainly need to make it such that fiscal gain is a part of your prerogative and motive in life. And it's not the case that I'm somebody who's inordinately interested in wealth or money or anything like that. I mean, I really don't give a shit. But I can see practically that being poor, well, relatively poor in a Western culture, is in an American culture, I should say, is not the best mode of existence you could choose to act out for yourself if you just want to feel as if your life is very meaningful. And more so, the reason for that, to a greater extent, outside of the physical health consequences of those, I guess, possible futures, is that whenever you are interacting, and this is also why I think common sense is bullshit, because part of your ability to relate to other people is to have a type of symmetry and experience, shared commonalities between this person and that person and the next. Part of the thing about American experience is that it's fairly differentiated amongst the tiers of socioeconomic classes. And it's the case that whether or not you have a certain set of experiences will make it such that won't be the final determining, or won't be the final arbiter or determining factor of your ability to relate to another person. But let's just say that whether or not you go to public school or Juilliard, I mean, I'm not saying it's like that for every individual or anything like that, because there's certainly temperamental variances that make it such, like whether or not you're an open and agreeable person, that makes it almost, but not completely, irrelevant, makes the background or class you've come from almost completely irrelevant. But that's not the case. It's not entirely that way. And because it is this way, you should certainly make it such that because I think social context is what people care about, period. And by social context, I mean themselves embedded in a community. and they would like to be within a community, and they would like for the community to value them. And the only way a community is going to value you is if they find you useful and they can relate to you. I mean, that's just the bottom line. I mean, because human beings are that simple. We're that simple. We're pragmatists and we're relational creatures. That's it. That's all we really are in terms of the matrix that make us up. So whenever you're thinking, I suppose, about, what strategies you should adopt for life, or how it is you should sort out, well, what would really make life meaningful, given where you should probably find out what context you fit in, or what world you're actually living in, I think is like the most appropriate way to think of it. And I suppose knowing which one you live in helps you better understand how to navigate it, or mediate it is the best thing that I can say. And mediating the landscape, man, that is a lifelong skill, and it will change I think it will change as you progress in life, and you have different responsibilities, and you belong in different tax brackets, man. Like, it's annoying. And it's just a case that, but, I mean, like, whatever. Anyways, it's just a case that figuring out what would be the biggest slice of pie for you, it, in a lot of ways, has to do with you figuring out where exactly you are in life, and what histories have led to your existence. Because part of the reason the hero story is very appealing to human beings is because, hell, that's how things actually feel. Or that's how things, that's the best phenomenological impression life has on you. Because, let's say, for example, you're decently bright as an individual, but, you live in the middle, let's say, let's say you're decently bright and you happen to grow up in Flint, Michigan or something, and, there's been plenty of problems with that water. Part of your existence is just going to be contending with those issues and trying to make sense of why your government would be structured the way that it is, given all the supposed benefits and promises that is spouted of it by most of the conservative faction that makes up your overall community. And part of the issue too is you're going to have to deal with the resentment and envy, potential envy of the fiscal success of people that are just maybe like a mile downtown, or like, no, it's probably not a mile, but like, just like they're in the same city, they're in the same, they're in the same state as you, but they just don't happen to occupy the specific geographical location that you do. But they're not that different from you, but their life is much better than yours just because of decisions, like decisions in infrastructure, like things that have next to nothing to do with they have a lot to do with human welfare, but, nothing you would count on. Like, your father didn't lose his job, your mom is a decent person, your siblings don't get on your nerves. Nothing is wrong with your familial unit per se, necessarily. I mean, like, there's some dysfunctionality, but it's your standard family, right? And you have to contend with these things in the world that you're like, well, what the fuck, man? I didn't do anything wrong. And I mean, like, a lot of life is like that, whether or not you realize it or not. You have to pay for many decisions which you never made. And a lot of that is slaying your dragons. I mean, like, well, it depends on what context you come from, because, I mean, if you're a privileged aristocrat, it might not seem like that, so I don't know, but it's the case that if you come from a lower middle class background, impoverished background, middle class, or even upper middle class background, it is going to be the case that there is a lot of shit in your life, or there are a lot of things in your life that you will have to overcome, and yourself on top of it, because you're not completely, well, just keep sticking with the context thing. But yes, that's why it's necessary to add to that. and yourself, because you're not exactly the most saintliest thing, and all of your proclivities and inclinations do not make it such that you will always turn out to be the hero of your own narrative. And quite oftentimes, you can play as a conspirator in your own tragedy if you're not aware. And so, when I talk about context, just think about histories and the fact that she liked to be a happy little lark in a. The only way you can be a happy little lark is by being embedded in some community that values you, and the only way you can get people to value you is through certain means. And so you should pain yourself to figure out how exactly you're going to address all of those things if you want to live a meaningful life. I mean, I think it's important. And the only way you can have autonomy, or the only way you can have a real will, is to be aware of just the state that you're in, like the status of your condition. You know, what is the human condition? Well, hello, this is part of it. So yeah, that's on context, and hopefully you found that interesting. Thank you for watching.